She had 48 hours to live. The noose was already measured, the grave was already dug, and the man who held the rope wasn't a judge. He was a sheriff with a grudge, a badge bought with bribes, and eyes that said he'd enjoy every second of it. Clara Whitlock was 22 years old. She hadn't pulled a trigger. She hadn't robbed a soul. But her last name was enough to sign her death warrant in this town. Then a stranger walked through that jailhouse door and changed everything. If this story grabs you, stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The jail cell smelled like wet hay and old iron, the kind of smell that gets into your teeth and stays there. Clara sat on the narrow wooden bench with her back against the stone wall and her wrists raw from the rope they'd used to drag her in. She hadn't cried. She'd decided that much. Whatever happened in the next 2 days, she was not going to give Sheriff Dale Hargrove the satisfaction of watching her break. Outside the single-barred window, the town of Coldridge, Colorado moved on without her. She could hear it. Boots on frozen boardwalk, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a woman laughing somewhere on the far side of the street. Normal sounds. The sounds of a world that had already decided she didn't belong in it anymore. She pressed her thumbnail into the wood grain of the bench and thought about her father. Not the version the town talked about. Silas Whitlock, outlaw, thief, killer. She thought about the other version. The one who used to cook salt pork and beans on a tin stove and let her eat the burnt parts off the bottom of the pan because she liked the crunch. The one who taught her to read by lantern light using a Bible he never actually believed in. The one who smelled like pine smoke and horse leather. He was dead now. Shot off his horse 3 weeks ago on the Gunnison Road, ambushed by men who wore badges and told the newspapers it was a lawful arrest gone wrong. Clara had been 3 miles east when it happened, fixing a broken wheel axle on their supply wagon. By the time she heard the shots and rode toward the sound, it was already over. She hadn't even had time to grieve before they came for her. Hargrove himself had come to collect her, with 4 deputies and a warrant that accused her of participating in a string of robberies across 3 counties. The list was long and detailed and entirely fabricated. Clara recognized exactly 2 of the dates on that paper. Both were days she could account for completely, days she'd been in entirely different places. But warrants didn't care about the truth. Warrants cared about signatures, and Hargrove had plenty of those. "You're the last Whitlock standing," he told her, very pleasantly, as his men put her on the back of a horse with her hands bound. "The debt your father left behind has to settle somewhere." She'd asked him what debt. He'd smiled and said nothing. That silence told her everything. Silas Whitlock hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen something that belonged to Hargrove specifically, or at least that was what the sheriff believed. And now that Silas was dead, the ledger was going to be balanced on his daughter's back, whether she'd earned that debt or not. The trial, if you could call it that, lasted 20 minutes. There was no attorney. There was no jury that hadn't already been spoken to. The judge was a thin man with watery eyes who didn't look at Clara once during the entire proceeding. He read the charges in a flat monotone, listened to Hargrove's testimony, asked if anyone wished to speak on behalf of the accused, and when the silence stretched out long and uncomfortable, he signed the paper in front of him and said, "Execution by hanging, 2 days hence." Clara had stared at the back of his head as the deputies pulled her to her feet. 20 minutes. That's what her life was worth in Coldridge, Colorado. The first night in the cell, a deputy brought her a tin cup of water and a piece of bread so stale it could have doubled his roof slate. He was young, maybe 18, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Hey," she said. He stopped. "Is there anybody in this town who isn't afraid of Dale Hargrove?" The boy looked at the floor. Then he looked at the door. Then he walked out without answering. That told her something too. The second morning, Hargrove came alone. He was a big man, not tall but wide through the shoulders and thick in the gut, the kind of bulk that made a room feel smaller when he entered it. He had a neat mustache and hands that were surprisingly clean for a man in his line of work. He pulled up the chair from the corner and sat down outside the cell door like he had all the time in the world, which Clara supposed he did. "I want to make you an offer," he said. Clara said nothing. "Your father hid something before he died. Something that belongs to me." He folded his hands over his knee. "I want to know where it is. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." "Then you think wrong." Hargrove studied her for a moment. His expression didn't change. That was the unsettling part. Most men showed something when they were angry. He showed nothing. "You've got about 36 hours left," he said. "I'm offering you a way to spend them differently. Tell me where Silas stashed what he took, and I'll have the judge reconsider the verdict. You'd walk out of here. Might even have a few dollars in your pocket." Clara looked at him directly. "My father never told me anything about any hiding place. Whatever he stole from you, and I'm not saying he did, he kept that to himself. I was his daughter, not his partner. The law doesn't make that distinction." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. That's the problem with the law around here." Something flickered across his face then. Not anger exactly, but the cousin of it. He stood up slowly and straightened his coat. "Think about it," he said. "You've got time." He left, and Clara pressed her back against the cold wall and focused on her breathing. She didn't know where her father had hidden anything. That part was true. But she also knew that even if she had known, giving that information to Dale Hargrove was a death sentence of a different kind. A man like that didn't leave loose ends alive. She was going to hang either way. The only question was whether she'd hang having given him something or not. She decided not. The stranger arrived late the following afternoon. Clara heard him before she saw him. Heavy, unhurried boots on the jailhouse floor. Not the sharp click of a man trying to sound important, but the solid, flat thud of someone who simply weighed a great deal and moved at exactly the pace he intended to move. She heard voices in the front room, Hargrove's, tight and controlled. Another voice, lower, that she couldn't make out the words of. Then the door to the cell block opened. He had to turn slightly sideways to get through the doorframe. That was the first thing she noticed. The man was enormous, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that suggested a life spent carrying things far heavier than most men ever touched. His coat was heavy fur-lined canvas, trail-worn to the point of near disintegration at the elbows, and he wore it open over a dark flannel shirt and canvas trousers tucked into boots that had seen several winters of serious work. His face was weathered to the color and texture of old saddle leather, and a beard that had been growing since sometime last autumn covered the lower half of it in dark, frost-flecked brown. He wasn't handsome, he wasn't ugly, he was just present, in a way that most people weren't, like a rock formation or a very large tree. He stopped in front of her cell and looked at her. His eyes were a pale, cold gray-green, the color of river water in November. She looked back. "You're Clara Whitlock," he said. "Last I checked. I'm Gideon Mercer." He said it the same way he might have said "it's raining," not introducing himself so much as stating a fact. "I trap and trade out of the Elk Range. I've got a cabin about 40 miles northeast of here." "Good for you." He didn't react to that. "I spoke with the sheriff. He says your debt stands at $300 in court costs and restitution, and that if that sum is paid, the conviction can be suspended pending appeal." He paused. "I know a man in Denver who handles appeals. He's not cheap, but he wins." Clara stared at him. "You don't know me?" "No." "Then why are you talking to me?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who didn't have an answer, but the silence of someone who was choosing their words with real care. "I need a wife," he finally said. "Winter's coming in hard this year. I've got more work on that mountain than one person can manage through the cold months. I've been looking for a woman willing to come up there, and every woman in this town either already has a husband or has the good sense to want nothing to do with the kind of life I'm offering." He looked at her steadily. "You don't seem to be in a position to have that kind of good sense." Clara was quiet for a long time. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "Yes." "You'd pay $300 to marry a woman you've never met." "I'd pay $300 for a capable partner who can work hard and isn't looking to run the moment spring thaw hits." His voice was flat, businesslike, and entirely without romance. "I'm not asking for affection. I'm not asking for something you don't want to give. I'm asking for a fair arrangement. You work the cabin alongside me through the winter and spring. I pay your debt and cover your legal costs. After 1 year, if you want to leave, you leave. No debt, no strings. And if I don't want to leave, then you don't leave." Clara studied him. He stood absolutely still. No fidgeting, no nervous habits, no tells that she could read. Just that steady, pale gaze and the faint smell of wood smoke and cold air that came off him like a second skin. Why not just hire someone? She asked. A ranch hand, a housekeeper. I tried that. 3 men quit inside of 2 months. The mountain's not for everyone. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not softness exactly, but honesty. And a hired hand can leave whenever the work gets hard. A wife has, he seemed to search for the word, invested interest. A wife is also a legal institution that's very hard to get out of. I told you, 1 year. After that, it's your choice. Clara looked down at her wrists. The rope burns were still there, red and angry against her skin. She thought about the noose. She thought about Hargrove's clean hands and his flat smile. She thought about 36 hours, which had probably become 24 by now. She thought about her father cooking burnt beans on a tin stove. She looked back up at Gideon Mercer. I want it in writing, she said. The arrangement, all of it. He nodded. I already had it drawn up. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a single folded sheet of paper, which he passed through the cell bars. Clara unfolded it and read it twice, slowly, checking every sentence. It was plain language, blunt, almost, the kind of document written by someone who didn't trust fancy phrasing any more than he trusted fancy anything else. But it said exactly what he'd said it would say. Payment of debt. 1 year of partnership. Her right to leave at the end of that year with no outstanding obligations. At the bottom, a line for his signature and a line for hers. His was already there. A plain, cramped hand. Gideon R. Mercer. She folded it back up and held it. The 1 year starts today, she said. From the day we reached the cabin, he said. That's fair. She considered this. Fine. She took the paper. She looked at the empty signature line. She thought, this is the strangest thing I have ever done. And then she signed her name. Bittik. Hargrove was not happy. She could tell that, even though his face barely moved when Gideon set the folded banknotes on his desk and the paperwork that followed. He counted the money twice, slowly, like he was hoping to find it short. He wasn't going to find it short. Gideon stood across the desk in the same absolutely still way he stood everywhere, and watched and said nothing. The appeal will take months, Hargrove said finally. I know, Gideon said. She's still legally under my jurisdiction until it's resolved. She's legally my wife as of 2 hours ago, Gideon said. And you have no outstanding warrant that applies to a married woman in good standing who has satisfied her financial debt to the court. I've spoken to the territorial magistrate. He reached into his coat again and produced a second sheet of paper, which he set on the desk without drama. He agrees with me. Hargrove's jaw tightened almost invisibly. He picked up the paper, read it, set it down. This isn't over, he said. Gideon looked at him with those pale November eyes. No, he said pleasantly. I imagine it isn't. They rode out of Coldridge in the early afternoon, with a sky the color of pewter pressing down on the mountains to the northeast, and the temperature already dropping fast. Clara rode a sturdy roan mare that Gideon had apparently brought from his own stock, sure-footed, calm, with a thick winter coat that said she knew what kind of country she was headed back into. Clara had almost nothing. A canvas bag with a change of clothes, her mother's pocket watch, and the knife she always kept inside her boot. Everything else her father had owned was either confiscated or gone. She didn't look back at Coldridge as they left. Gideon rode ahead on a massive dark horse that moved with unusual patience, matching its pace to the terrain rather than fighting it. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't offer reassurances. He just rode steady and northward, following a trail that gradually narrowed and steepened as the pines closed in around them. After about 2 hours of silence, Clara pulled her coat tighter against the wind and said, You married women you've never met before? No, he said. He didn't turn around. But you've thought about it. A pause. I'd thought about it as a possibility, hadn't found the right situation. What made this the right situation? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, You didn't beg him. She frowned. What? Hargrove. When I came in to talk to him, I heard the end of your conversation through the door. He was telling you to think about it. Gideon kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Most people in that cell, they'd have started negotiating by then, telling him whatever he wanted to hear just to buy time. He paused. You didn't. Clara thought about that. Would that have mattered to you, if I had? Yes, he said simply. She didn't have a response to that, so she didn't say anything. The trail climbed, the trees got taller and older, and the light between them got thinner. Snow that had fallen 2 days ago still lay in the shadows, undisturbed and blue-white in the fading afternoon. Somewhere far above them, through a gap in the pines, Clara caught a glimpse of a ridgeline, jagged granite against the pewter sky, high enough to make her chest feel slightly tight. Up there. That's where they were going. She had traded one kind of cold for another, but she was alive, and the paper in her coat pocket said she had a year to figure out what that was worth. She rode on into the mountains, behind the silent man she'd married that morning, and she didn't look back. The cabin appeared out of the trees like something the mountain had grown rather than built. It sat on a wide, flat shelf of rock, maybe 200 feet below the ridgeline, backed against a granite wall that cut the worst of the north wind and faced south toward a valley Clara hadn't known existed until the trail crested the final rise and suddenly dropped away below them in a sweep of white and dark pine. The structure itself was low and heavy, notched logs chinked with dried moss and gray clay, a roof weighted down with sod and a foot of snow, a stone chimney on the east wall that was wide enough she could probably have sat inside it. There were 2 small windows, both shuttered. A lean-to on the west side sheltered a pair of mules and what looked like a season's worth of split firewood stacked chest-high under a canvas overhang. It was not beautiful. It was, however, clearly built to last. Gideon dismounted without ceremony and led his horse toward the lean-to. Clara sat in her saddle for a moment longer, looking at the place that was apparently her home now, breathing air so cold and clean it almost hurt. "You built this yourself?" she called. "Most of it," he said without turning around. "Took 3 summers." She got down. Her legs were stiff from the ride and the cold, and she didn't entirely trust them on the icy ground, but she managed without grabbing the saddle horn, which felt important somehow. She followed him to the lean-to and watched him unsaddle the dark horse with the efficient, practiced movements of a man who had done this particular thing several thousand times. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. He glanced at her. Slightly surprised, she thought, as if he'd expected her to go inside and sit down. "You can grain the mules if you want. Bin's on the left wall." She found the grain bin and the scoop and fed both mules while he finished with the horses. Neither of them talked. The mules were placid and warm-breathed and didn't care who she was, which she appreciated. When the animals were settled, Gideon led her inside. The interior was one large room with a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder on the far wall. A cast-iron stove dominated the center of the space, cold now but surrounded by evidence of recent use. A blackened coffee pot, a cast-iron skillet, a split log that served as a step stool. The walls were hung with tools, pelts at various stages of preparation, coils of rope, and 2 rifles on wooden pegs beside the door. A rough-hewn table with 2 mismatched chairs sat near the south window. Shelving along the east wall held dry goods, flour, salt, dried beans, tins of various sizes, organized with the focused precision of a man who knew that running out of something up here wasn't an inconvenience, it was a crisis. There was one bed. It was in the loft. Clara looked at the ladder. Then she looked at Gideon. "There's a bedroll in the chest under the table," he said, already crouching in front of the stove to build a fire. "I'll sleep down here." "It's your bed. I've slept on the floor before." He didn't say it defensively, just factually. She let it go. The fire took hold quickly under his hands, and within 20 minutes the stove was radiating enough heat to make the small space genuinely warm. Clara sat at the table with her coat still on and her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute she'd been making do with since her father died, and felt something in her chest unclench by a fraction. Gideon sat across from her with his own cup. He'd shrugged off the heavy fur canvas coat, and without it he looked slightly less like a mountain and slightly more like a man. Still enormous, still quiet, but there was something almost tentative about the way he sat, like a person who wasn't entirely sure how to behave in company. "Rules," he said. She looked up. "Not orders," he added quickly. "Just how I run things up here. So you know." "Go ahead. We share the work equally. I don't believe in one person doing everything while the other watches. If something needs doing, Whoever sees it first does it. He turned the cup in his hands. I go out on the trap lines 3, sometimes 4 days a week. When I'm out, you're responsible for the cabin, the animals, and the perimeter. I'll show you what that means. When I'm here, we split it. What does perimeter mean? Wolves. Mountain lions come down sometimes in hard winters. Last February, a male black bear that should have been hibernating decided our lean-to looked interesting. He said this without drama, like it was just a fact of the altitude. I'll show you the rifle. I know how to shoot. He looked at her. How well? Well enough that I'm the one saying it and not someone saying it for me. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Fair enough. We'll see. He laid out the rest of it plainly. They'd need to stretch and cure a significant number of pelts before the deep cold set in to make the spring trade worthwhile. The root cellar below the cabin needed to be fully stocked before the first heavy snow made access unreliable. There was a section of the roof over the lean-to that needed reinforcing before February's wait. And there was the small matter of the smokehouse, which needed a new clay seal on its doorframe, or they'd lose the meat they'd preserved to freezer burn in varmints. It was a lot of work. Claire had grown up doing hard work, so she cataloged it without flinching. You said 3 men quit, she said when he finished. In the first 2 months. Yes. What made them quit? He was quiet for a moment. The quiet, mostly. Men who are used to town find the silence hard after a while. And the isolation. If something goes wrong up here, there's no one to call for. You handle it yourself or it doesn't get handled. He looked at his cup. Also, the second man I hired drank. I didn't know that when I hired him. By November, he was more problem than help. And the third? The third was just young, not his fault. Clara nodded. She thought about the silence she'd already noticed on the ride up. The way it wasn't absence of sound so much as a different kind of sound. Wind, trees, the creak of ice, a thickness in the air that felt, after years of living in and around frontier towns with their constant human noise, almost physical. I'm not going to say the silence won't bother me, she said honestly. I don't know yet, but I'm not afraid of work and I don't drink, and I'm not young enough to make that an excuse for anything. He looked at her over his cup. How old are you? 22. That's young. It doesn't feel young. He considered that. No, he said. I imagine it doesn't. They sat with that for a moment, and the fire popped and shifted inside the stove, and outside the wind moved through the pines in the long, low moan that Clara would come to know as intimately as her own breathing over the following weeks. What about you? She asked. What about me? How old? 34. You been up here the whole time, since you built it? Mostly. I come down for trade in April and September. Otherwise, he shrugged. This is where I'm supposed to be. It was an odd way to put it. Not where I want to be or where I prefer to be, but where I'm supposed to be. Like the mountain had made a specific request, and he was the only person who'd answered it. Clara didn't ask him to explain it. She filed it away instead. I'm going to sleep, she said, and pushed back from the table. The loft's yours, he said again. Gideon. She stopped at the base of the ladder. You paid $300 for a working partner. A working partner doesn't sleep in the loft while you freeze on the floor. It's wasteful. She looked at him directly. The loft's big enough for 2 people who keep to their own side. If that's acceptable to you. He looked back at her for a long moment. That's acceptable, he said. She climbed up. The mattress was thick ticking, stuffed with pine needles and wool scraps. Not particularly comfortable, but dry and clean and substantially better than a jailhouse bench. She lay on her back in her clothes with her coat pulled over her and stared at the underside of the sod roof and listened to Gideon move around below her. Banking the stove, checking the door bar, the ordinary sounds of a man closing up for the night. Then the creak of the ladder, the shift of the mattress as he settled onto his half, on top of the covers with his coat pulled up. He was so still and so quiet that within minutes she could almost convince herself she was alone. Almost. She lay awake for a long time, watching her own breath cloud in the cold air above her, and thought, you are alive. And then, for now, that's enough. She slept. The first 2 weeks were the hardest, not because Gideon was cruel or demanding. He wasn't either of those things. He was patient in the methodical way of someone who understood that teaching a person correctly once was more efficient than correcting them repeatedly. And he showed her everything she needed to know, without condescension and without the particular flavor of frustration that men often showed when a woman turned out to know less than them about something they considered basic. He showed her the trap lines and how to reset them. He showed her how to read the smoke from the chimney to know when the fire needed feeding. He showed her the telltale signs in the snow around the lean-to that meant a predator had been investigating, and what to do about it. She learned fast, which seemed to satisfy him in some quiet way he didn't articulate. What was hard was everything else. The cold was a different order of magnitude than anything she'd experienced at lower elevation. It wasn't the sharp, moving cold of a winter wind on the plains. It was a deep, still, penetrating cold that settled into stone and wood and bone and simply stayed there. Her hands cracked at the knuckles within the first week. She burned herself twice on the stove trying to cook with fingers that had gone partially numb. She slipped on ice she hadn't seen and went down hard on her left hip and sat in the snow for a moment afterward with her jaw tight, refusing to make a sound before getting back up. Gideon saw the second fall from across the yard. He didn't rush over. He didn't fuss. He waited until she'd gotten up and dusted herself off. And then he said from a distance, "Ice forms under the overhang even after a clear day. The melt from the roof refreezes overnight." "I'll remember that," she said through her teeth. "There's sand in a bucket by the door. Scatter it on that strip every morning." Fine. That was how he handled her mistakes. Not with pointed silence or backhanded commentary, but with the next useful piece of information. She had grown up around men who turned other people's errors into entertainment. It took her longer than she expected to stop waiting for him to do the same. The cooking was a negotiation that neither of them had expected to have. Gideon's approach to food was purely functional. Fuel was fuel, and he would eat the same 4 things in rotation indefinitely without apparent dissatisfaction. Clara had grown up cooking on a campfire for her father and various members of his crew, and while she was no trained cook, she had opinions about food that went somewhat beyond bare survival. After the 3rd consecutive night of salt pork boiled with dried beans and nothing else, she went through his shelves more carefully and found dried chilies, a small tin of lard, cornmeal, and 3 jars of something preserved in late summer that turned out to be dried wild onions. She made corn cakes with the onions fried into them and served them alongside the inevitable beans. Gideon looked at his plate. Then he looked at her. Then he ate without speaking for a while and finally said, "That's better than what I usually make." Coming from him, she understood, this was significant praise. "You had everything you needed," she said. "You just weren't using it." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I suppose I wasn't." After that, the cooking became hers, without either of them formally deciding it, though Gideon insisted on cleaning up afterward, which he did with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to everything. Clara decided she could live with that division. Small things. That was how it happened. Not in large declarations or careful negotiations, but in 100 small, unremarked adjustments that gradually shaped the space they shared into something with a logic of its own. It was in the 4th week that she found out about the war. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been reorganizing the east wall shelving, a project she'd undertaken because the system Gideon had established was logical but inflexible. And she'd realized they could gain another 18 inches of usable storage by moving the rope coils to hooks above the window. When she shifted a large tin canister and found, tucked behind it, a folded piece of cloth. She picked it up without thinking. It unfolded in her hands to reveal a faded military insignia. A cavalry unit patch, she thought, though she didn't know enough about such things to identify it precisely. It was worn at the edges and had a brownish stain on one corner that she suspected, with a small cold feeling, was blood. She was still holding it when Gideon came in from the trap lines. He stopped in the doorway. The look that crossed his face was not anger exactly. It was something more complicated and less controllable than anger, a flash of something raw that he shut down so fast she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him. "I was reorganizing," she said carefully. "I didn't mean to put it back where you found it." His voice was even, flat, the same tone he used for everything, but underneath it something stretched tight. She folded it back up the way it had been and set it behind the canister. She went back to the shelving without saying anything else, and he moved past her to the stove and poured water from the kettle into the basin and washed his hands with his back to her. For 3 days after that, he was different. Not cruel, not cold, exactly, but absent. Like a significant portion of him had moved somewhere she couldn't follow, and only the functional part remained, doing the work, passing the salt at dinner, banking the stove. She'd known men who disappeared into drink. She'd known men who disappeared into rage. This was neither. This was something quieter and harder to name. She didn't push. She'd learned, watching her father navigate men like this, that pushing was the wrong tool for certain kinds of silence. On the 4th night, the blizzard came. It announced itself in the afternoon. A shift in the wind from northwest to due north, a drop in temperature so sudden it felt purposeful, and a stillness in the animals that Gideon noticed and she'd learned to notice too. By the time they'd secured the lean-to roof with extra rope and brought the mule's grain supply inside and banked the stove with an extra measure of fuel, the first real snow was already coming sideways through the trees. By nightfall, they couldn't have opened the front door if they'd wanted to. The storm hammered the cabin for 18 hours. The sound of it was enormous. Not a howl, but a sustained structural roar. The sound of a weather system with specific intentions. Clara lay in the loft and felt the cabin flex and settle around them like a living thing. And she counted the logs in her head and thought about Gideon's 3 summers of building and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she trusted the walls. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, maybe 2, maybe 3 in the morning, she heard him. Not words, just sound. Low and involuntary, the kind of sound that comes out of a person when they're not quite awake and not quite asleep, and something is happening inside them that their waking self has learned to keep down. She lay still and listened and heard it again. A short, choked exhalation, and then the creak of movement, and then nothing. Then, sorry, his voice rough with sleep and something else. Did I wake you? I was already awake, she said, which wasn't true, but seemed kinder. She sat up. In the darkness, she could see the outline of him, sitting up on his side of the mattress, forearms on his knees, head dropped forward. What was it? A long pause. Dream. Bad one? Another pause. Outside, the blizzard shook the shutters on their iron pins. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, after a silence that stretched almost past the point of comfort, he said, I was at Wilderness Creek, 1864. I was a cavalry sergeant. She waited. There was a bridge, he said. We were supposed to hold it for 6 hours until the infantry came up. 12 men. He stopped, started again. They didn't come up. Not in 6 hours. Not in 12. His voice was controlled, but only technically, like a rope holding a weight that was slightly too heavy. I got 3 men out. The dream is never about what actually happened. It's always about the ones I didn't get out. Clara sat in the dark and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. She knew the particular arithmetic of survivor's guilt. She'd watched it work on her father, though for different reasons in a different war of his own making. She knew that the wrong response to it could do real damage. What she did was shift across the mattress until she was sitting close enough to him that her shoulder was against his arm. Not touching, exactly, just proximate, available. He went very still. You don't have to talk about it, she said. I'm just going to sit here for a while. He was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, some of the terrible tension in his shoulders released. Not all of it, but enough. He didn't move away from her. 3 men out of 12, he said again, quietly, to the darkness. 3 men who lived because of you, she said. The other math is real, but so is that one. He didn't respond, but he didn't move away. They sat like that in the dark while the blizzard tore at the world outside. 2 people who had each survived things they hadn't expected to survive, holding the cabin walls between themselves and the cold. And that was, for that night, enough. Clara didn't offer comfort she couldn't back up. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, because she didn't know the whole story, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She just stayed. When she finally lay back down, he did too. And when morning came gray and exhausted through the shutters, neither of them mentioned it. But something had shifted. Something that didn't have a name yet, but occupied a new and specific weight in the space between them. But the weeks after the blizzard were different. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been obvious to anyone watching from outside. But Clara felt it, in the way he started telling her things without her asking. Small things, practical things, but things nonetheless. The story behind the cabin's unusual door bar, which he'd engineered after a mountain lion managed to work a standard latch loose one March night while he slept. The reason he'd chosen this particular shelf of rock to build on, which had to do with a spring that didn't freeze even in the hardest winters, 50 yards east of the cabin, hidden in a thicket of young aspens. The fact that he'd once tried to keep a dog up here, and the dog had been killed by a wolf in the first autumn, and he hadn't tried again. He told her these things in the evenings, at the table, with coffee, in the same flat, unembellished voice he used for everything. But he told them. And she listened, and told him things in return. About her father, about the various frontier towns she'd moved through as a child, about the 2 years she'd spent working in a laundry in Pueblo when Silas was in jail, and she'd been on her own at 16 and had to figure out fast what she was capable of. "You were alone at 16, he said, when she told him that. 16 and a half, she said, like the half mattered. He looked at her across the table. That's young to be alone. You were at Wilderness Creek at what, 20? 21. Then we were both young for what we had to do. She wrapped her hands around her cup. The difference is you've been carrying yours for 13 years, and I've had 2 months. He was quiet. Then, does it get lighter? She thought about that honestly. I don't think it gets lighter. I think you get stronger, or you get used to the weight. One of those. He turned his cup in his hands. I'm not sure which one I'm doing. Neither am I, she said. But you're still here. That counts. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't elegant. But it was the truth. And he received it the way he received everything she said that seemed to mean something to him. With that small, careful stillness that was, she was slowly learning, his version of acknowledgement. Outside, the mountain winter continued its work. Patient, indifferent, relentless. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had each believed, at different points and for different reasons, that they were likely finished, discovered incrementally that they were not. The firewood stack dropped and was replenished. The pelts accumulated on their frames. The root cellar held. The roof over the lean-to survived February. The spring that didn't freeze gave them water even on the coldest mornings. And somewhere in the grinding daily work of it, in the cold mornings and the shared meals and the evenings at the table, and the one night in a blizzard when she'd sat close enough to let him know he wasn't alone, what had started as a transaction was becoming something neither of them had specifically planned for. She noticed it first in herself, the way she'd started thinking of the cabin as ours rather than his. The way she listened for his boots on the path when he was out on the trap lines and felt something ease in her chest when she heard them. The way his silences no longer felt like closed doors, but like a particular quality of air she'd learned to breathe in. She didn't say any of this. It was too new and too fragile, and she'd learned enough caution in 22 years to know that the most dangerous thing you could do with something fragile was call attention to it before it had time to harden. But she noticed. And she was fairly certain, from the way his eyes tracked her across the cabin sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, that she was not the only one. The winter deepened. The mountain kept its counsel. And down below, in the town of Coldridge, Dale Hargrove sat behind his desk with a name on a piece of paper and a patience that had no season at all. The first sign came in the form of a dead horse. Gideon found it on a Tuesday morning in early March, about a mile down the main trail, where the path curved around a granite outcropping before the long descent toward the valley floor. The animal had been shot once, cleanly, through the neck, not an accident, not a predator. Someone had put a bullet in it deliberately and left it there, either because the horse had gone lame and they couldn't be bothered with a proper job of it, or because they wanted to travel the rest of the way on foot and leave no animal tied somewhere to be noticed. He came back to the cabin without the pelts he'd gone out to check and stood in the doorway with snow on his coat and an expression Clara had learned to read as controlled concern, the particular flatness that came over his face when something required careful thought rather than immediate action. "Someone's on the trail," he said. Clara looked up from the stove. "Coming up or going down?" "Shot was from above. They're already between us and the valley." She set down the spoon she was holding. "How many?" "One horse, could be one rider, could be 2 if they were doubling up." He came inside and shut the door and moved to the rifle pegs without hurrying. Could be a trapper who lost his animal to a bad leg and had to make a decision. Could be something else. She heard what he didn't say. You think it's something else? I think we've been up here all winter without a single visitor, and now someone's moving through my trail on foot in March, and the timing of it sits wrong with me. He took down the Winchester and checked the load with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done it under pressure before. Have you seen anything in the last week that seemed off? Clara thought. She'd have been out 2 days ago to check the spring. The aspens were still bare but starting to show the first swelling of buds on the lower branches, and she'd noticed boot prints in the mud near the rock shelf above the water. She'd thought at the time that they were old prints, winter compressed and distorted. Now she wasn't sure. She told him. He listened without interrupting. Show me tomorrow, he said. Today, we stay close. They stayed close. Gideon spent the afternoon doing visible work in the yard, splitting wood that didn't urgently need splitting, moving around the lean-to, presenting the picture of a man with no particular awareness of anything unusual. Clara understood the performance and matched it, going about her own business within his sightline, keeping her movements unhurried. No one appeared, but that night, lying awake in the loft with the stove ticking quietly below, Clara turned over her father's business in her mind and tried to think like him. Silas Whitlock had run with a crew of 6 men before his death, 2 brothers named Cord and Roy Pelham, a former railroad surveyor called Dutch, who handled logistics, and 3 others whose names she'd heard but never known well. After Silas was killed and she was arrested, she'd assumed the crew had scattered. That was what crews did when the center of them was gone. But Dutch was not the scattering kind. And Cord Pelham, the older brother, had a habit of finishing things. It was, her father had told her once with a complicated pride, both his best and his worst quality. If any of them believed she knew where the hidden money was, or the map, or whatever exactly her father had taken from Hargrove, they would come looking eventually. The question was what had taken them until March. The answer, when she worked it through, was obvious. They'd had to find her first, and that meant someone in Coldridge had talked, which meant Hargrove's patience had gotten impatient, and he decided to use a different set of tools. She climbed down the ladder and found Gideon already sitting at the table in the dark with his coffee cup, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. I think I know who it is, she said, and sat down and told him everything. He listened the way he always listened, completely still, nothing on his face, absorbing it all before he said a word. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Your father's crew, he said. You think Hargrove pointed them at you. Hargrove wants what my father took. So does the crew. If they find it first, Hargrove loses his leverage. If Hargrove finds it first, the crew gets nothing. She turned her cup in her hands. They're using each other without trusting each other. Hargrove gave them my location, and now they're trying to get here before he can send his own men up. Which means we might have 2 separate problems coming. Yes. She paused. Or we might have one problem that we can turn into 2 if we're careful about it. He looked at her across the dark table. Explain. If the crew gets here and finds nothing, and then Hargrove arrives with deputies, those 2 groups are not going to cooperate. They're going to get in each other's way. She worked it out as she spoke, feeling the shape of it. But first we have to survive the crew. How many do you think? Cord and Roy Pelham for certain. Maybe Dutch, maybe 1 or 2 others. She thought about Cord, his patience, his precision, the way her father had described him once as a man who plans everything except what to feel about it. Cord won't rush it. He'll watch the cabin first. Learn the routine. He won't move until he's sure. How long do we have? If he got here today, he'll want 2 or 3 days of observation before he acts. She looked at Gideon, which means we have 2 or 3 days to make his observation work against him. A long silence. Outside, the March wind was softer than February's had been. Still cold, but without the structural violence of deep winter. The aspens would have buds on them by now in the lower valley. Spring was coming, slow and reluctant, the way it always came to high country. Gideon said, "Tell me what you're thinking." Well, what Clara was thinking was born from 2 decades of watching her father prepare for trouble, distilled through her own understanding of the land she'd spent a winter learning. She laid it out for Gideon in plain language, without dramatics, and he listened and asked questions, Precise, practical questions about sightlines and distances and the specific geography of the rocky ground east of the cabin. And gradually, what she'd started as a rough idea got refined by his knowledge of the terrain into something that might actually work. The cabin sat on a shelf of rock with the granite wall to the north and a clear approach from the south and west. The east side was the complicated side, a tumble of boulders that descended steeply toward a dry creek bed about 40 feet below, interspersed with scrub pine and deadfall. It was terrible ground to fight across, which was exactly why Gideon had never worried much about that approach. Nobody in their right mind would try to come at a cabin from that direction, which was precisely why, Clara argued, they should plan for it. Because Cord Pelham was not nobody, and he would look at the geography and see the same thing they saw, and he would send someone around the east side specifically because a defender would discount it. Gideon looked at the east terrain for a long moment when she explained this to him, his pale eyes tracking the boulders and the scrub and the angles of approach. "You're right," he said. "I know." She didn't say it to be smug. She said it because there wasn't time for false modesty. "I'll take the east. You take the south approach. The west wall is the blind spot. We need something there that works without either of us being present." "What kind of something?" She thought for a moment, then walked to the lean-to and looked at the coils of rope hanging on the west wall. "Tripline, low, about 8 inches off the ground, strung between those 2 pine trunks. Attach a tin can with stones in it to the end. It won't stop anyone, but it'll make enough noise to tell us they're there." Gideon considered this. Then he went to the rope coils and began measuring lengths with his arm span. They spent all of the next day in preparation. The trip line went up on the west approach, nearly invisible against the pine duff. Clara walked the east terrain twice, once in daylight, carefully mapping the natural cover, and once at near dark when the shadows changed everything, because if this came to a fight, it would likely come at dawn or dusk. She found 3 positions behind boulders that gave her sightlines to the most navigable paths through the rocks, and she noted the distance from each to the cabin door. She was not afraid exactly. She was something more focused than afraid, a compression of attention that she'd felt before, in bad situations, and had learned to trust as more useful than panic. Gideon saw it in her, she thought. He watched her come back from the second survey of the eastern terrain, mud on her boots and her hair coming loose from its braid, and he said, "You've done this before. Been in a situation where you had to think through violence before it arrived." "My father's world had a lot of those situations," she said. "I mostly stayed on the edges of them. But you learn being on the edges." "You're not afraid." "I'm afraid," she corrected him. "I'm just not letting it run the meeting." He held her gaze for a moment. "That's a good way to put it." "My father said it first." She looked away toward the tree line. "He said a lot of things I disagreed with and a few things I'll probably think about for the rest of my life." They ate early that night and slept in shifts. Gideon first, 4 hours, then Clara, while he sat at the table below with the Winchester across his knees. It was not comfortable, and neither of them slept particularly well, but when the gray pre-dawn light started coming through the shutters on the second day, they were both upright and functional. It was the silence that told her, at first light on the third morning. Not the good silence, not the quality of air she'd spent a winter learning, the alive silence of the mountain going about its business. This was a held silence, the kind that happened when the birds stopped because something was moving through the trees that didn't belong there. She touched Gideon's arm once, lightly, and he nodded. He'd heard it too. They separated without speaking, him to the south window, her to the door, which she opened 3 inches and no more, the way they'd agreed on. The cold morning air came in sharp and smelling of pine and wet rock. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then the tin can rattled on the west approach. One man, moving too fast and not careful enough about what was at ground level. Clara had counted on that. Cord would be patient with his own movement, but he'd put his least experienced man on the approach he considered least important. She held her position. Then she saw the one coming through the eastern boulders. Moving carefully, yes, but not carefully enough because he didn't know someone had already walked that ground twice in the dark and knew exactly where the footing was deceptive. He was a big man, unfamiliar to her, moving in a low crouch between the rocks with a rifle across his chest. She was behind the cabin's east-facing wall in the gap between the main structure and the lean-to, 7 feet from the corner. She waited until he was committed to his line, past the last good cover, moving toward the open ground between the boulders and the cabin wall. She stepped out and put the barrel of the rifle 2 feet from his left ear and said very quietly, "Don't." He froze. "Put it on the ground," she said. "Slow." He put it on the ground. His hands were shaking, which told her he was young and this was not his usual kind of work. "On your knees," she said. He went down. She secured his wrists behind him with a length of cord she'd had in her coat pocket and left him kneeling against the cabin wall, out of direct sightlines from either the south or the west approach, and went around the corner at a low crouch. The south approach was where the real problem was. She heard it before she saw it, a sharp exchange of voices, Gideon's flat and controlled, the other voice familiar in a way that landed in her stomach like cold water. Cord Pelham. Older, rougher looking than she remembered, but the voice was exactly the same, precise, unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided long ago that emotion was a tax he wasn't willing to pay. He had Gideon in the open, halfway between the cabin door and the tree line, with a pistol leveled at him. Roy Pelham stood 10 feet to Cord's left with a rifle. Dutch was nowhere she could see, which worried her. Gideon had his hand slightly away from his body. Not raised exactly, but visible. His face showed nothing. "I'm going to say this once," Cord was telling him in the calm, reasonable tone of a man explaining directions. "I don't have any business with you. I have business with the woman. You step aside and we're done here." "She's my wife," Gideon said. The word was flat and uncomplicated in his mouth. A statement of fact, not an appeal. "I understand that. Doesn't change my business." "It changes mine." Clara was at the corner of the cabin wall, 8 feet from Roy Pelham's unguarded right side, with the rocky terrain she'd spent 2 days memorizing at her back. She looked at the angles. She thought about Dutch. She thought about the young man kneeling on the east side with his wrist tied, who would not be a problem. She stepped around the corner. "Cord," she said. Both brothers turned. Roy's rifle came toward her and then stopped, because she had her Winchester at her shoulder and she was pointing it at Cord's chest, and her hands were entirely steady. Cord looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, not surprise, but a reassessment. "Clara Whitlock," he said. "Clara Mercer," she said. "Where's Dutch?" A pause. "He didn't make the climb." "You're lying." Cord almost smiled. "Old habit." "Look to your right," she said. He looked. Dutch was standing 20 feet away at the tree line with his hands raised because Gideon, in the moment everyone's attention had shifted to Clara, had drawn his sidearm from under his coat and already had it pointed at him. Dutch, who had always been the pragmatic one, had evidently decided that 2 guns from 2 directions was not a position he was interested in holding. Roy Pelham looked back and forth between his brother and Clara, and then at Gideon, doing the arithmetic that Clara had already done, and his rifle lowered by about 6 inches. "Roy," Cord said quietly. "Don't." "Cord." "I said don't." Cord kept his eyes on Clara. He still had his pistol raised, but he'd recognized the geometry of the situation, which was that he was the most exposed person in it. "You've got the high hand," he told her. "Say what you want to say." "My father didn't tell me where he hid anything," she said. "I've told Hargrove that. I'm telling you. Whatever he took, whatever map he made, I don't have it, and I don't know where it is." "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to consider the alternative." She held the rifle steady. "You've known my father for 15 years. You know how he operated. Did Silas Whitlock ever tell anyone anything he didn't have to tell them?" A pause. "No," Cord said. "He didn't." "Then why would he have told me?" Another pause, longer this time. She could see Cord working it through, the same calculation she'd run herself 100 times through the winter, the same conclusion she'd always arrived at. "Because you're his daughter," he said, but he said it without conviction. "He loved me," she said. "He also kept his business out of my life because he knew what his business was. Those 2 things aren't contradictions. You know that, Cord. You knew him." The silence stretched. Roy's rifle was down at his side now. Dutch hadn't moved. The young man on the east side, she could hear, had started quietly crying, which she filed away as not her immediate problem. Cord lowered his pistol. "Not all the way." to about 45 degrees, the position of a man who hadn't made a final decision but was no longer pointing it at anything specific. "Hargrove told us you had the map," he said. "Hargrove told you what was useful for him to tell you." She kept the Winchester up. "He wanted you to find it before his own men did. He was going to let you do the work and then take it from you afterward. That's how he operates." Cord stared at her for a long moment. Then he glanced at Roy, then back at her. He had the expression of a man who was reaching an unpleasant conclusion about a plan he'd thought was clever. "Son of a bitch," Roy said quietly, apparently having arrived at the same place through a different route. "Put it on the ground, Cord," Clara said. "All of you. We're going to have a conversation, and then you're going to go back down that mountain and decide what you want to do about Hargrove on your own time." Cord looked at her for another moment. She could see him weighing it, pride against pragmatism, which in her experience was a calculation that usually went poorly for pride when the odds were clearly stated. He bent and put the pistol on the snow. Roy followed. Dutch, still with Gideon's gun on him at the tree line, let his own rifle down into the snow and raised his hands higher with the resigned expression of a man who had always suspected this particular venture would end badly. "Gideon," Clara said without taking her eyes off Cord. "I've got them," he said. She lowered the Winchester. Not all the way. "Okay," she said to Cord. "Let's talk." They talked for the better part of an hour. There in the cold morning light, with guns on the ground, and the young man on the east side eventually brought around and released, with his hands rubbly and his pride somewhat demolished. Clara told Cord everything she actually knew, which was less than he'd expected and more than she'd ever told anyone, about Hargrove's specific accusation, about the warrant, about the structure of the debt her father had apparently left behind. Cord, in the wary manner of a man giving more than he intended, told her that the sum Silas had supposedly hidden was not money, but a hand-drawn map to a placer gold deposit her father had stumbled on 4 years earlier in a creek bed north of the Elk Range and never told anyone about. He told her this and then watched her face for recognition and found none. "You really don't know," he said. "I really don't know," she said. He rubbed his jaw. Hargrove knew about it because Silas told him once, drunk years ago. Hargrove's been trying to get the map ever since. That's what this whole thing is actually about. The robberies, the warrant. All of it was leveraged to get Silas to give up the location. And Silas wouldn't. Silas would have let them hang him before he'd give Hargrove anything, Cord said. And there was a complicated grief in his voice that Clara recognized because she'd felt it herself. Stubborn old man. She was quiet for a moment. "Is the map real?" "We don't know. We've never seen it. Silas told Dutch about it once, said he'd written it down and put it somewhere safe. We never knew where." He looked at her steadily. "We thought you might. I didn't even know the map existed until 30 seconds ago." Cord nodded slowly. He looked tired, she noticed, older than he'd looked in her memories. The winter had been hard on him too, by the look of it, in ways that had nothing to do with weather. "So we both came up this mountain for nothing," he said. "You came up this mountain because Hargrove wanted you to," she corrected him. "Which means Hargrove has his own plans for what happens after." Cord looked at her. Then he looked at the mountain below them, the long descent through the pines toward the valley and the town beyond it. Something shifted in his expression, the specific kind of shift that happened when a man accepted a reality he hadn't wanted to accept. "He's probably already sent men," he said. "Probably." "Then we've got a shared problem," Cord said. "We've got a shared problem," Clara agreed. "But that doesn't make us allies, Cord. I want to be clear about that. When this is over, you go your direction and we go ours." He looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like your father." "I know. He'd have liked how you handled this morning," Cord said, and there was nothing in his voice except the plain truth of it, which was worse somehow than sentiment would have been. He looked past her at the cabin. He'd have really liked this morning. She didn't answer that. She couldn't. Gideon came to stand beside her, not touching her, not making any display of it, just standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. She felt the steadiness of him there, and was grateful for it in a way she couldn't have explained. "You need to be gone before Hargrove's men get here," Gideon said to Cord. "Take your people and go east, not down the main trail." Cord picked up his pistol from the snow and holstered it. "What are you going to do?" "Handle it," Gideon said simply. Cord looked at him, then he looked at Clara. Silas was a fool about most things, he said finally, but he was right that a person's character shows in a crisis. Good luck to you. He turned and walked into the trees. Roy followed without speaking. Dutch paused long enough to look at Clara with a complicated expression and then go after the others. The young man who'd come around from the east hurried after them with the air of someone who would be processing this morning for quite some time. Clara watched the trees close around them. The mountain was quiet again. That real quietness, the alive kind, already returning as the unnatural tension of armed men moved away through the pines. She realized her hands were shaking, not fear exactly. The aftermath of focus, the moment when the compression releases and the body remembers what it was holding. She kept them at her sides and breathed through it. Gideon noticed. Of course he noticed. He turned to face her and looked at her steadily, and didn't say anything about her hands, just said, "You did well." "We did well," she said. "Yes." He paused. "But that was your plan, start to finish." She looked at him. His face was as unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes, that same quality she'd first started noticing after the blizzard, the thing she hadn't been able to name yet. It was warmer than respect, she thought, and more specific than gratitude. "We have to find the map," she said, "before Hargrove does." "Do you have any idea where your father would have hidden something like that?" She thought about it. The tin stove, the lantern light, the Bible he never believed in. She thought about the pocket watch her mother had left her. Heavy, silver-cased, the kind with a small compartment behind the face that her mother had used to keep a photograph. Clara had never opened that compartment since her mother died. It had felt like trespassing. Her hand went to her coat pocket. The watch was there. It was always there. She took it out and looked at it for a moment, and then she opened it. Behind the face, folded 4 times into a square no larger than her thumbnail, was a piece of paper. She unfolded it with fingers that were not quite steady. Gideon stood very close without crowding her, his shadow falling over her hands in the morning light. It was a map, hand-drawn in her father's cramped, half-legible hand, with compass marks and distances and a creek labeled with a name she didn't recognize. In the corner, in smaller writing, it said, "For Clara, if she's the one who finds this. I'm sorry I couldn't do better, girl." She stared at it for a long time. Then she folded it back up and closed her fist around it, and she did not cry. She would not cry. Not on this rocky shelf in the cold March morning with Hargrove's men already climbing somewhere below them. But she stood with her fist closed and her eyes on the middle distance for a long enough moment that Gideon, without any particular ceremony, put his hand over her fist and left it there. She didn't move away. After a while, she breathed out. "We need to make a decision about this map," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't remove his hand. "A fortune like this? It doesn't make life simpler. I've watched what money does to people who aren't ready for it." "I know. It could change everything about what we've built up here." She opened her fist and looked at the small folded square. "Or it could just change who's coming for us." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" She looked at him. "What do you want to do?" "I want," he said carefully, "to do whatever keeps you safe and keeps this—" He glanced back at the cabin, the lean-to, the split wood, and the spring 50 yards east in the aspens. "Intact." She looked at the map for another moment. Then she looked at the ground beneath their feet. The granite shelf her father had never seen. The mountain that had asked for Gideon specifically and gotten them both. "Then I think," she said slowly, "we need to put this somewhere that Hargrove can't reach it. And we need to do it before he gets here." She looked up at Gideon. "And then we need to deal with Hargrove." He met her eyes. "Together," he said. It wasn't a question. "Together," she said, and meant it completely. They burned the map that evening. Not carelessly. Not the impulsive destruction of something that frightened them, but a deliberate decision made at the table with cold coffee between them and the last of the March light dying outside. Clara had unfolded it one more time and read her father's handwriting again, the cramped compass marks and the creek name she didn't recognize, and the small note in the corner that she wasn't going to read aloud to anyone, ever. Then she folded it back and held it over the candle flame and watched it take. Gideon watched with her. He didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. The paper curled and blackened and was gone in under a minute. Clara set the ash on the tin plate and pressed it flat with her thumb until there was nothing left that could be read or reconstructed. That's done, she said. That's done, he agreed. She looked at her hands for a moment. The rope burn scars from the jailhouse were almost gone now, faded to pale lines across the inside of her wrists that she sometimes found herself tracing without thinking about it. She pressed her palms flat on the table. Hargrove won't believe it's gone. Even if we tell him, he'll think we're hiding it. I know. So burning it doesn't actually solve the problem. No, Gideon said. It just changes what the problem is. He turned his cup in his hands. Before we had something worth killing us for. Now we just have something worth coming after us for. The distinction being, a man who wants to kill you to take something is harder to maneuver than a man who wants to find something you might know. He looked at her steadily. If Hargrove believes the map still exists and that one of us knows where it leads, he needs us alive and cooperative. That's leverage if we use it correctly. Clara looked at him. She thought about the military insignia behind the canister on the east wall shelf. She thought about a cavalry sergeant who'd held a bridge with 12 men for twice the time he'd been given. You've been thinking about this. All day, he said, while you were watching the tree line. Tell me, he told her. It was not a comfortable plan. It had the quality of plans made by people who understood they were not in a strong position, built on misdirection rather than force, dependent on Hargrove's greed behaving the way greed reliably behaved, and requiring Clara to do something that Gideon visibly did not want to ask her to do. She could see him working up to that part, the slight tightening around his eyes that was his version of reluctance. The abandoned mine, she said, before he got there. You want to use the mine. He looked at her. You know it? I scouted east of the cabin 2 weeks ago when you were on the trap lines, found the entrance. She'd found it by accident, following a strange depression in the snowpack that turned out to be a partially collapsed tunnel roof. The mine was old, pre-war by the look of the timbering, and had been worked and abandoned long before Gideon built the cabin. The main shaft ran roughly 60 feet into the granite before the supports gave out and the ceiling came down. The structure's unstable. Very, he said. I went down about 30 feet once, years ago, and the timbering was already half rotted. I haven't been back. You want to lead Hargrove into it. I want to give Hargrove a reason to go into it himself, he said, which was a meaningful distinction. If we tell him, or let him believe, that the map leads to a shaft entrance inside that mine, he'll want to see it. A man like Hargrove doesn't send other people to look at something like that. He goes himself to make sure no one else can claim it. And inside the mine? Inside the mine is your part, he said, and there it was. The tightness around his eyes, the thing he didn't want to ask. You'd have to go in first. Get to the junction shaft before he does. There's a secondary collapse point about 40 feet in. I can show you where it is tomorrow. The supports there are holding by habit more than anything else. A single well-placed strike with the right tool would bring down that section of the ceiling, she finished. Yes. She looked at him. You want me to be inside a collapsing mine tunnel with Dale Hargrove. I want you to be inside a mine tunnel, he said carefully, that you know thoroughly and that Hargrove doesn't. You'd be ahead of him at the junction with a clear path back to the secondary entrance. He'd be behind you at the collapse point with no path at all. He paused. I'd be at the primary entrance. He'll bring deputies. I'll hold them outside. How many deputies? He brought 4 to arrest you in Coldridge, probably the same or more for this. She did the arithmetic. It wasn't comfortable arithmetic. That's a lot for one man to hold. I won't be holding them exactly. I'll be occupying them. There's a difference. Something shifted in his face, not the false confidence of someone who didn't understand the odds, but the genuine steadiness of someone who had calculated them and made peace with the number. I've been in worse positions. Wilderness Creek, she said quietly. Yes. He held her gaze. The difference is that this time I built the ground myself. I know every rock and every sightline on this mountain for half a mile in every direction. Hargrove's men will be in strange country in the dark. He paused. And this time I'm not doing it alone. She looked at him for a long moment. The candle between them had burned down to a stub, and the light it threw was uneven and warm, and in that light he looked not younger exactly, but less armored than usual. Like the man underneath the 11 months of winter and the 13 years of a bridge in Virginia was visible for a moment. If something goes wrong inside that shaft, she said, then I come in after you. Gideon, I come in after you, he said again, flat and final, in the tone that meant the discussion was over. That's not negotiable. She breathed out. Okay. She pulled the ash-pressed tin plate toward her and looked at the nothing left of her father's map. When do you think he'll come? 2 days. Maybe 3. He'll have gotten word from Cord's people by now that the crew came up empty. He'll know that buys him time before the crew regroups, and he'll want to move before they do. He leaned back in his chair. He'll come with enough men to be certain. He won't rush it, but he also won't wait too long. That's how he operates. That's how he operates, she agreed, son. I spent 3 days in his jail. I watched him. She thought about those clean hands, the flat mustache, the watery-eyed judge who hadn't looked at her once. He's patient until he isn't, and when he tips from patient to moving, he moves fast. There won't be a lot of warning. Then we need to be ready tonight. They were. Hargrove came on the second afternoon, which was earlier than Gideon had predicted and later than Clara had feared, and he came with 6 deputies instead of 4, which adjusted the arithmetic in ways neither of them had quite planned for, but which was not, in the end, a surprise. A man who had waited as long as Hargrove had waited for this particular resolution was not going to understaff the ending of it. Clara saw them from the eastern rock face, where she'd positioned herself at first light to watch the lower trail. 6 men on horseback and Hargrove in front on a pale gray horse that moved with the deliberate pace of its rider. No hurry, no urgency. The walk of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. She watched them come up the last switchback through the scope of Gideon's second rifle, a long-barrel Sharps that she'd spent the previous day learning the particular quirks of, the way it pulled slightly left at distance and needed compensation, and counted heads and noted that 2 of the deputies were carrying shotguns, which meant they were planning for close quarters, which meant Hargrove expected resistance and had staffed accordingly. She worked her way back to the cabin in a low, fast crouch, using the boulder terrain she knew by heart now, and came through the rear of the lean-to just as Gideon was finishing with the horses. He looked at her once and read her face. 6, she said. 2 with scatterguns. He's 40 minutes out. He nodded. He handed her the canvas bag with the tools she'd need for the mine, a short pry bar, a miner's candle in a clay holder, a length of rope, and the specific iron wedge they'd identified 2 days ago as the thing that was holding the secondary collapse point in approximately the state it was in. You need to be in position before they reach the cabin. I know. She took the bag. She looked at him. There was something she'd been carrying since the evening they burned the map. Something that had been building longer than that, if she was honest with herself, building since a blizzard in February and a man sitting with his forearms on his knees in the dark. She'd been waiting for a better moment to say it, and she was looking at him now and understanding that there might not be a better moment. Gideon. He was checking the load on the Winchester. He looked up. I'm not leaving at the end of the year, she said. I want you to know that before this happens, whatever this turns into today, I'm not leaving. He was very still for a moment. The Winchester was in his hands and the afternoon light was coming sideways through the lean-to boards, and somewhere down the mountain, Dale Hargrove was 40 minutes away with 6 armed men. Okay, he said. Not as a dismissal, as an acceptance, complete and unqualified. She nodded once. She picked up the bag. She walked out of the lean-to and up the eastern slope toward the mine entrance, and she did not look back because she couldn't afford to, not now, and because some things didn't need to be looked back on to be real. 1. The mine entrance was a low, dark mouth in the rock face, barely visible behind a collapse of scrub brush that had grown across it over decades of disuse. Clara pushed through, lit the miner's candle, and moved into the shaft. The smell of it hit her immediately. Cold stone and old rot, and the specific mineral damp of ground that hadn't seen moving air in years. The timbering was exactly as bad as Gideon had described. Ancient, square-cut logs, gray and punky with dry rot, holding up a ceiling of fractured granite through some combination of compression physics and luck. The floor was uneven, scattered with rockfall from previous partial collapses, and the candle threw shadows that moved wrong in the close space. She moved carefully and quickly, counting her steps. The junction was at 32 feet. She'd paced it from the entrance the day before with Gideon, identifying the point where a secondary shaft branched off to the right, running parallel to the main entrance for another 20 feet before it emerged through a crack in the rock face on the mine's south side. That crack was barely large enough to squeeze through sideways, which was why it wasn't visible as an entrance, and why no one coming into the mine from the main shaft would know it was there. She found the iron wedge at 30 feet, just where they'd left it, driven between the two main support timbers on the left wall at a specific angle that, when removed, would start a chain reaction in the failing timbering around it. It would not be instantaneous. Gideon had walked her through the physics of it. The removal would start a slow progression, timber shifting on timber, granite settling into the gaps. She'd have somewhere between 40 seconds and 2 minutes before the ceiling came down, and the variance in that estimate was what she was least comfortable with. She moved to the junction. She crouched in the opening of the secondary shaft, candle held low to preserve her night vision, and she waited. She heard them from a long way off. Hargrove's voice first, that controlled, pleasant baritone that she associated with jailhouse conversations and bad choices. And then other voices, the specific silence that was Gideon's, and the sounds of multiple men moving on rocky ground. They were at the cabin. She couldn't see any of it from here, but she could hear it in the way sound traveled through the mountain stone. The granite carried vibration like a wire. She heard a door. She heard a raised voice that wasn't Gideon's. She heard, at some point, what might have been a shot, and her hands tightened on the pry bar before the sound resolved itself into something else, something less final, and she made herself breathe slowly. She had to trust him. She had spent a winter learning that Gideon Mercer was exactly what he presented himself as. No more, no less. And that what he presented himself as was a man who did not quit. She trusted that now, with the same certainty, she trusted the secondary shaft exit, which she had measured herself and tested herself and was certain of. Footsteps. At the mine entrance, she blew out the candle. In the darkness, she heard Hargrove say, "Bring a light," shuffling, the orange flicker of a lantern appearing at the tunnel mouth. Then Hargrove's voice again, closer, more interested. "How far does it go?" A deputy's voice. "Can't tell, sir. At least 40, 50 feet. The map said the main shaft," Hargrove said, mostly to himself. She could hear the specific quality in his voice, the focused, suppressed excitement of a man who has been patient for a very long time and believes he is finally at the end of his patience. "Keep the light up. Watch the ceiling." Footsteps in the shaft. One man, then the sound of a second. The light from the lantern grew as they moved inward. Clara pressed herself into the secondary shaft opening, her back against the cool rock, the pry bar in her right hand and her feet planted on solid ground. She counted steps. At 12 steps in, the lantern light would start to illuminate the area around the wedge. At 15, Hargrove would be close enough to see that the timbering had been disturbed. At 20, he'd be at the collapse point. She counted. 12. "Sheriff," the deputy's voice, uneasy. "These supports don't look—" "They'll hold," Hargrove said. "Keep moving." 15. "Sir, there's a wedge here that's been—" She didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. She reached around the corner of the junction opening, found the iron wedge by touch, gripped it with both hands, and pulled. It resisted for a terrible half-second, and then it came free with a sound like a rifle crack, a sharp, percussive pop that echoed off the stone walls. And above her she heard the first deep groan of granite settling, and she was already moving. Into the secondary shaft, low and fast, one hand trailing the wall, counting her steps in the absolute dark because the layout was in her body now, and not in her eyes. Behind her the sounds built. First the individual cracks of failing timber, then a sliding, grinding progression that she felt more than heard, vibrating up through the rock under her boots. 10 steps. 15. The crack of light appeared ahead, the pale gray of early evening coming through the fissure in the rock face. Behind her the world came down. Not all at once. Not the instantaneous catastrophe she'd imagined, but a building collapse. Section after section. The kind of sound that started loud and got louder in stages. Each stage a different register of destruction. She felt the pressure wave of displaced air hit her back as she pushed sideways through the fissure and came out on the south face of the rock with the cold evening air on her face and her knees hitting granite, and she caught herself with her hands and stayed up. She was out. She was whole. She stayed crouched against the rock face for a moment, breathing through her mouth, listening. The collapse sounds had diminished to a series of smaller settlings, pebbles and dust, the mine finishing its work. She heard, distantly, shouting. Men's voices, outside the main entrance, the particular tone of voices reacting to something they hadn't expected. She moved. Around the south face of the rock, staying low, using the terrain the way she'd learned to use it over a winter of daily movement on this specific mountain. The granite outcroppings as cover, the deadfall as concealment, working her way toward the main entrance where she could already see, from the angle she was approaching, the shapes of 4 men bunched near the mine mouth. 4, which meant Hargrove had brought 2 men into the shaft with him. She stopped behind a boulder 15 feet from the group and assessed. The 4 deputies were in a loose cluster, facing the collapsed entrance, not looking behind them. Their body language was that of men who were shocked and not yet coordinated, the specific window of vulnerability that comes just after an unexpected event and just before people start making decisions. "Don't move," she said, from behind the boulder. They moved. Of course they moved. Men always moved. 2 of them turned with weapons coming up, and she fired the sharps over their heads, and the sound of it in the open, rocky space was enormous, and they stopped. "Next one's not over your head," she said. "Guns on the ground." They looked at each other. They looked at the mine entrance. They looked at the boulder she was behind, calculating whether they could take her, doing the arithmetic on what it would cost to be wrong. "She's not alone." Gideon's voice, from the tree line to the north. He was there. She hadn't seen him, which meant they certainly hadn't seen him, and the voice came from the dark of the pines with the flat authority of a man who was entirely comfortable in that position. The guns went down. "Where is he?" one of the deputies said, a young man with a ginger mustache and the dazed expression of someone whose day had gone significantly worse than planned. He was looking at the mine entrance. "Where's the sheriff?" Clara came out from behind the boulder. She kept the sharps up. "He went into an unstable mine to find a map that doesn't exist anymore," she said. "That's where he is." The deputy stared at her. "You have to go in after him. You have to—" "That shaft is down," she said. "Anyone who goes in now doesn't come out." She watched him process this, watched the specific realization cross his face that Dale Hargrove, the man who had signed their pay vouchers, who had pointed them at this mountain, who had organized their lives through his absolute confidence in his own outcomes, was not coming back out of that rock. "Your sheriff made his choices," she said. "All the way back to the beginning, he made choices. This is the last one." The silence after that was total. Then, from somewhere deep inside the mountain, a sound. Not the active sound of collapsing stone, but a faint human sound. A voice, muffled beyond comprehension by 100 tons of granite. One of the deputies took a step toward the entrance. Clara did not lower the rifle. "Don't," she said. He stopped. The sound from inside the mountain continued for a moment, then stopped. Then it was quiet. Gideon came out of the tree line. He had the Winchester and a cut on his left forearm that was bleeding freely enough to have soaked the sleeve of his flannel shirt, which Clara saw and catalogued and dealt with later in her mind. He came to stand beside her and looked at the 4 deputies and then at the mine entrance and then at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He looked at her for a moment, that complete searching look that had become familiar to her over winter, the one that was checking something deeper than surface. Then he nodded. "You 4, he said to the deputies, his voice level and calm. "You're going to ride back to Coldridge tonight. You're going to tell the territorial magistrate what happened here. Every deputy in that town is going to give a deposition about what Dale Hargrove has been doing and why. And you're going to do this because the alternative is being named as accessories to attempted murder, which is a significantly worse outcome than cooperating." He paused. "I have documentation of Hargrove's arrangement with the criminal crew that came up this mountain 3 days ago. I have records of the fraudulent warrant used against my wife. I have a very good attorney in Denver who has been waiting for exactly this situation." He looked at each of them in turn. "Do you understand me?" The ginger-mustached deputy looked at the mine, then at Clara, then at Gideon. He appeared to be doing a comprehensive reevaluation of his career choices. "Yes, sir," he said. The others followed. Clara watched them collect their horses from where they'd been tied below the cabin and begin the long descent. She stood with the sharps until they were out of sight through the trees, and then she let the barrel drop and felt the weight of the afternoon settle into her all at once, the shaking she'd held off during the mine, the raw skin on her palms from the rock face, The specific hollow feeling that came after sustained fear released its grip. Gideon was already tearing a strip from the inside of his coat to bind his forearm. She walked to him and took the strip from his hands without asking and wrapped the wound herself, pulling it snug and tying it off. He let her. He watched her hands work with that same quiet attention he brought to everything. "How bad?" she asked. "Rock fragment. It's not deep." He flexed his fingers experimentally. "I've had worse shaving." "You don't shave," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "True." She tied off the bandage. She didn't let go of his arm immediately. She stood holding it with both hands and looked at the mine entrance, the collapsed mouth of it, the raw earth and broken timber visible in the fading light, the mountain having made its final statement about what it would and wouldn't permit inside its rock. "It's over," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. "This part," Gideon said. "Yes." She looked at him. "What other parts are there?" He considered this. The magistrate, the attorney in Denver, making sure the right version of this story is the one that gets told. He paused. "And whatever comes after that. The ordinary parts." He said ordinary parts like they were something specific and valuable, which she supposed they were. "The cabin needs the roof repair we put off through March. The spring trade run is in 2 weeks. The east shelf of rock is going to need drainage work before next winter, or we'll have ice problems under the lean-to." Clara looked at him. She started to say something and then didn't and then did. "You're describing the rest of the year." "I'm describing the rest of as long as we're up here," he said, and his voice was the same flat, even tone he used for all of it, the weather, the work, the arithmetic of hard situations. But underneath it was the same thing she'd heard in "I Come In After You," unambiguous and completely undecorated. "If that's acceptable." "You know it is," she said. "I told you, in the lean-to." "You did," he agreed. "I wanted to say my version." She almost laughed. It came out as something smaller, half a breath, but real. "The roof," she said. "The trade run. The drainage work. And the south window needs a new shutter hinge," he added. "The cold worked the old one loose." "Then we have a lot to do," she said. "We have a lot to do," he confirmed. He looked at the mine one more time, a long, level look that she couldn't entirely read, though she'd been reading him for months now. Whatever was in it, he left it there. Then he turned away from it and toward the cabin, and she walked beside him in the early evening cold with the mountain going quiet around them, and the aspens in the hollow below the spring showing their first green in the gray light, barely visible, tentative. But there, the mine was behind them. Hargrove was behind them. The map was ash on a tin plate. In front of them, the cabin, the stove that needed banking, supper that needed making, a window hinge that needed fixing, and morning, which would come whether they were ready for it or not. The ordinary and necessary morning of a life that was, improbably and at considerable cost, entirely their own. The south window hinge got fixed the following morning. It was not a dramatic repair. Gideon pulled the old hinge pins with a pair of pliers while Clara held the shutter steady, and then he drove new pins cut from a strip of iron stock he'd had in the lean-to, and the whole thing took about 20 minutes, and neither of them said much while it was happening. When it was done, he swung the shutter open and closed twice to test it, and it moved clean and quiet on its new hardware. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They had breakfast. Gideon's arm was stiff where the rock fragment had caught him, and he favored it without acknowledging that he was favoring it, which she'd learned was simply how he handled physical damage. Not stoically, exactly. More like he didn't consider his body's complaints particularly relevant to what needed doing. She changed the dressing without making a ceremony of it. The wound was clean. It would scar. Most things on this mountain left a mark if they touched you. The week after the mine was the strangest week Clara had spent since riding up the mountain in November. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. It was strange precisely because of its ordinariness. They repaired the roof over the lean-to, working from opposite ends toward the middle with tar and fresh-cut shingles while the April sun came down on their backs with the first real warmth of the year. They turned over the kitchen garden plot on the south-facing slope below the cabin, breaking the frost-hardened soil with a mattock and working in the composted matter from the bin Gideon had been accumulating through winter. They took inventory of the pelt stock for the spring trade run and found they had considerably more than a single season's work accounted for, which was the first genuinely good surprise Clara could remember in recent memory. She kept waiting for something to arrive, for the other boot to drop, for some complication from below to work its way up the mountain. She'd lived long enough in Silas Whitlock's world to distrust the quiet that came after a crisis. The quiet was always temporary. The quiet was where the next thing assembled itself. But the days passed, and the next thing didn't come. And gradually she began to understand that this particular quiet was different. Not the held breath quiet of something building, just weather, just spring, just a mountain going about its seasonal business of thawing and warming and waking up, indifferent to the specific human dramas that had played out on its granite face over the past winter. The letter from Gideon's attorney in Denver arrived 2.5 weeks after the mine, carried up by a trader named Beasley, who made a monthly supply run through the high country and who had approximately no curiosity about anyone's personal affairs, which was part of why Gideon had used him for correspondence for years. Clara watched Gideon read it at the table and read his face while he read, which by now she could do reasonably well. "Tell me," she said. He set the letter down. The 4 deputies gave full depositions, all of them. He paused. Apparently, when a man of Hargrove's particular character disappears in a mining accident while conducting what can only be described as extra-legal activities, the people who worked for him find their loyalties rearrange themselves fairly quickly. "The ginger-mustached one," she said. "I had a feeling about him. He was apparently the most detailed of the 4. Gideon looked at the letter again. "The fraudulent warrant against you has been formally voided. The conviction is expunged. You are not, as of the date of this letter, a wanted woman in the territory of Colorado." She sat with that for a moment. She'd known it was coming. The attorney had been confident when Gideon had written to him in March. But knowing something is coming and having it arrive were different experiences. She'd been Silas Whitlock's wanted daughter for so long that the alternative felt like a category she didn't entirely have a shape for yet. "And the mine?" she asked. "Hargrove's closed. Territorial Marshal's office has designated it a sealed incident. The official report says the sheriff pursued a lead without authorization, entered an unstable structure against local advice, and died in the resulting collapse." Gideon looked at her over the letter. No mention of us beyond a witness statement that we were present and attempted to warn him. "That last part isn't entirely accurate." "No," he agreed. "But it's not entirely inaccurate either. We did know the structure was unstable." She looked at him. "Your attorney is very good." "He's expensive," Gideon said, but yes." She picked up the letter and read it herself, slowly, checking each section against her own understanding of what had happened and what had been agreed to. The language was careful and precise, which she respected. When she put it down, she pressed her palm flat on it for a moment, like she was confirming it was real. "What about Cord?" she asked. "No action against the Pelham crew. Insufficient evidence of criminal activity on the mountain specifically, and without Hargrove to push it, nobody in the territorial office seems interested in climbing up here to investigate." He folded his hands on the table. "They've likely moved on. Cord's not the type to linger where there's nothing to gain." She thought about what Cord had said in the cold March morning. "He'd have really liked how you handled this morning," and the specific kind of grief underneath it. Cord Pelham was not a good man, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But he had loved her father in his way, and grief made people do things that had nothing to do with who they actually were. She hoped he'd go somewhere far and quiet, and find some version of a life that didn't require coming up mountains looking for dead men's maps. She wasn't going to bet money on it, but she hoped. "It's done," she said. "Really done." "Really done," Gideon said. She exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries something out of the body that has been held there for a long time. She sat back in her chair and looked at the cabin around her. The rifle pegs by the door, the east wall shelving with its organized stores, the cast-iron stove that had been the center of gravity of her winter, the ladder to the loft. She looked at all of it and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness, exactly. Too complicated for that. More like the feeling of weight correctly distributed. Like a load that had been carried wrong for years, finally settled onto the right part of the shoulder. Gideon was watching her. He did that sometimes. Watched her think without interrupting it, patient in the specific way he was patient about everything that mattered. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He didn't ask it often. When he did, it meant he genuinely wanted to know. I'm thinking about my father, she said, and about the fact that I spent most of the last year being angry at him and grieving him at the same time, which is an uncomfortable combination. She looked at the table. And I'm thinking that he put that map in my mother's watch because he knew I'd never open it unless I absolutely had to. He knew me well enough to know I'd treat whatever was in there as sacred. She paused. He was using that against me. Even from the grave, he was being tactical. Maybe, Gideon said. Or maybe he put it there because he knew you'd protect it without knowing you were protecting it. Because you were the only person he trusted that completely. She looked at him. That's a more generous reading than he probably deserved. Maybe, he said again. But it might also be true. She thought about it. The two things could both be true. Silas being tactical and Silas trusting her completely. They weren't contradictions. They were just the same complicated man seen from different angles. She'd spent a winter on this mountain learning that people were rarely one thing all the way through, that the version of a person you thought you knew was usually just the angle you'd been standing at. Gideon had shown her that. The blizzard had shown her that. Her own reflection in the mine shaft's absolute dark had shown her that. I forgive him, she said. It came out plainly, without particular weight, like a fact that had simply become true at some point without her consciously deciding it. I don't think I could have said that in November, but I can say it now. Gideon nodded. He didn't make more of it than it was. Good, he said. That's a useful thing to be able to say. The spring trade run to Sweetwater Junction took 4 days, down and back, and it was the first time Clara had been below the mountain since the November morning she'd ridden up it. The descent was disorienting in ways she hadn't anticipated. The air thicker, the sound of the world louder, the smell of wood smoke and horse and human habitation hitting her like something physical when they rode into the trading settlement. She'd lived in towns her entire life before November, and she hadn't expected to find them foreign after 5 months away. But she did. Or not foreign exactly, just smaller, louder than they needed to be, more crowded with the kind of noise that didn't say anything. The trading went smoothly. The pelt quality was good, and Gideon had a long-standing relationship with the buyer at Sweetwater that was built on years of fair dealing from both sides. And Clara watched how he operated in the transaction. Unhurried, specific, absolutely unwilling to take less than what the quality warranted, but equally unwilling to push for more. The buyer knew what he had. Gideon knew what he had. The price they landed on was fair, and both men shook hands with the satisfied expression of people who hadn't wasted each other's time. You could get more, she told him afterward, when they were loading the supply wagon. The beaver especially. The quality's exceptional this year. I could get more once, he said. Then he'd remember I pushed him, and next year it would start from a different place. He checked the wagon hitch. Long-term fair beats, short-term maximum, every time. She thought about that. Her father had operated on the opposite principle. Maximum extraction from every situation, every person, because there might not be a next time. It had worked for a while. Then it had gotten him shot off a horse on the Gunnison Road. Fair point, she said, and meant it on more levels than one. 2 men in the settlement recognized her name. She saw it happen when the trading post operator wrote it in his ledger, saw the small pause and the quick glance up. She held still and let them look. Neither said anything, which was a statement in itself. The wanted woman, the outlaw's daughter, the girl they'd have said was heading for a bad end. She was standing in a trading post in April buying flour and salt and a new hinge pin for a south window, and the world appeared to have run out of specific objections to this. On the second night, they stayed at the settlement's single boarding house. 2 rooms, 30 cents each. The landlady, a brisk woman named Mrs. Garfield, who had apparently decided that a man and woman traveling together for trade were none of her business and treated them accordingly, which Clara appreciated enormously. She was sitting on the edge of the narrow boarding house bed, working through the supply accounts by candlelight, when Gideon knocked on the connecting door. She opened it. He was holding 2 tin cups of something that smelled like it came from a bottle rather than a kettle. The man in the room at the end of the hall had whiskey, he said. He was willing to share a portion for a fair price. She looked at the cups. You drink whiskey? On specific occasions. He held one out. She took it. She looked at him over the rim of it. What's the occasion? He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all questions. The occasion is that 6 months ago I walked into a jailhouse and made a proposal to a woman I'd never met, and it turned out to be the best decision I've made in my adult life. And that seems like the kind of thing that warrants a small acknowledgement. Clara looked at him for a long moment. His face was the same unreadable, weathered face it had been in November. Same gray-green eyes, same beard that was now properly long enough to have acquired a kind of character, same absolute stillness. And also completely different in the way that anything looks different when you understand it. 6 months ago, you told me you needed a working partner, she said. I did need a working partner. That's all you said you needed. It's all I knew how to say at the time. He looked at the cup in his hand. I'm somewhat better at saying things than I was in November. I think that's your influence. She thought about this blizzard, about the dark and his forearms on his knees and the thing he'd carried for 13 years, about the wedge in the mine shaft and the 40 seconds she'd had to get clear and the way the world had come down behind her, about 100 evenings at that table with coffee and the specific quality of his silences and what she'd learned to hear in them. Gideon, she said. Yes. Stop talking and drink the whiskey. Something moved across his face that she'd catalogued by now, the thing that was his version of a smile, that lived in the corners of his eyes more than his mouth. He raised the cup. She raised hers. They drank. The whiskey was rough and warm and not particularly good, and she didn't care at all. They rode back up the mountain on the fourth morning with the supply wagon loaded and the horses moving well on the familiar trail. And somewhere around the last switchback before the cabin's shelf of rock came into view, Clara felt the change in herself that she'd been aware of distantly for several weeks, but was only now prepared to name. She was not afraid, not of the mountain, not of the winter coming again, not of the isolation, not of the work. She had been afraid of all of those things in November, had ridden up this trail with the specific terror of a woman who had traded one unknown for another and had no guarantee that the trade was good. She had been afraid in the blizzard and in the mine and in the cold March morning when Cord Pelham's men came through the trees. Fear had been the constant undercurrent of every month she'd spent on this mountain. But somewhere between the thaw and the letter from Denver and 2 tin cups of mediocre whiskey in a boarding house, the undercurrent had changed its nature. It hadn't disappeared. She wasn't naive enough to believe that life on a mountain in the high Rockies was going to stop presenting situations that warranted fear. The wolves would still come in winter. The weather would still do what it wanted. The work would still be hard and constant and physical in ways that left marks. But she wasn't afraid of those things in the way she'd been afraid of the unknown. She knew this mountain now. She knew its trails and its weather patterns, and its particular silences and what they meant. She knew the spring that didn't freeze and the section of eastern rock face where the footing was deceptive, and the way the smoke from the chimney bent south before a storm. She knew these things the way you know the inside of your own body, not always consciously, but reliably, deep and below thought. And she knew the man riding beside her, not completely. She doubted she'd know him completely in 20 years. He was not a simple person, and the layers of him went down a long way, and some of those layers had old damage in them that would take longer than a winter to work through. But she knew the important parts. She knew he meant what he said. She knew he did what he said he would do. She knew he would go into a collapsing mine after her without a second thought and complain about his arm less than she complained about her cracked knuckles. She knew, and that knowing was not the same thing as certainty, but it was the closest thing to it that she'd found in 22 years of looking. The cabin came into view around the last bend, low and solid on its granite shelf, the chimney cold in the April morning, the lean-to holding its shape, the aspen grove below the spring showing leaves now, small and bright and new. It looked exactly as it had looked when she first saw it in November, which was to say unglamorous and purpose-built and exactly what it needed to be. No more, no less. It looked like home. She hadn't had one of those in a long time. She hadn't realized how much the absence of it had weighed on her until the weight was gone. Gideon pulled the wagon up to the lean-to, and they began unloading in the practiced, wordless way they did most shared work now, each knowing which part to take, which boxes went where, the rhythm of it established over months of repetition. She carried the flour sack inside and set it on the east wall shelf in its designated space, and straightened up and looked at the cabin interior and felt, for approximately the 100th time, the specific solidity of a space that had been thought about carefully and built to last. "Clara," Gideon called from outside. She went to the door. He was standing at the edge of the lean-to looking east, toward the aspen grove and the hidden spring. She came to stand beside him and looked where he was looking. 3 elk were at the spring, a cow and 2 calves. The calves barely a few weeks old by the look of them, their legs still that newborn, awkward length that looked slightly too long for their bodies. They were drinking in the late morning light with the aspens bright around them, and they hadn't noticed the humans at the lean-to yet, or if they had, they'd decided it wasn't their problem. Clara and Gideon stood there and watched them. She didn't have anything to say about it, and he didn't either, and that was fine. Some things didn't need commentary. Some things just needed witnesses. After a while, the cow lifted her head and looked toward the cabin with large, dark, unconcerned eyes. Then she went back to drinking. The calves shifted and bumped against each other with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of very young things. "Next winter will be harder than the last one," Gideon said eventually. It was not pessimism. It was just a fact he was sharing, the way he shared facts, plainly, without drama, because knowing the true shape of things was always more useful than not knowing it. "I know," she said. "The drainage work on the east shelf is going to take most of June. I know that too. And the roof over the main cabin needs attention before October. Not urgent, but it won't stay not urgent." "Gideon?" "Yes." She looked at him. "I know all of this. I've been here for 6 months." He nodded. He looked back at the elk. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it because—" He paused, and she recognized the pause, the specific quality of him searching for the right words rather than the easy ones. "Because this is what the life is. The roof and the drainage, and the next winter and the work that doesn't stop. I want to make sure you know what you're staying for, not just the idea of it." She looked at him for a long moment. He was watching the elk, his profile steady and serious in the April light, and she thought about the 22-year-old woman who had signed her name on a paper in a jail cell with raw wrists and 48 hours to live, not knowing what she was signing toward, only knowing what she was signing away from. That woman would have found what she'd become in the past 6 months unrecognizable. Not because she was a different person, she was exactly the same person, but because she'd found out what the person she'd always been was actually capable of when the circumstances required it. That was the thing about survival. It didn't change you. It showed you what was there. "The drainage work in June," she said. "The roof before October. The winter after that." She looked at the cabin, the lean-to, the aspens with their new leaves, the elk at the spring. She looked at the man beside her. "That's what I'm staying for. All of it. Even the parts that are just work." He turned and looked at her. Really looked. The way he had on very few specific occasions. In the jailhouse, in the blizzard dark, at the junction of the secondary mine shaft after she'd come through the fissure and he'd been there to ask if she was hurt. That complete searching look that meant he was checking something deeper than surface. Whatever he found, it satisfied him. She could tell by the way the set of his shoulders changed, fractionally, imperceptibly, to anyone who hadn't spent 6 months learning to read him. "Okay," he said. Just that. But she'd learned by now what he meant by it. The elk finished drinking and moved off into the aspens, the calves bouncing slightly with each step in the clumsy joy of new legs and new grass, and a world that was still too large and too interesting to take carefully. The aspens closed around them. The spring ran on. Gideon went back to the wagon. Clara went to help him with the remaining supplies. There was flour to store and salt to check against the winter inventory, and a new axe handle to fit, and the south window hinge to test again now that the weather was warming and wood expanded differently in heat than cold. There was supper to make, and the stove to bank, and the animals to settle. There was, in other words, everything. The ordinary and necessary everything of a life being lived in a real place by real people who had earned every inch of what they had and knew exactly what it had cost. Clara Whitlock, Clara Mercer, picked up the last box from the wagon and carried it inside, and the cabin door closed behind her, and the mountain held its particular silence, the living kind, the kind that wasn't absence but presence, the sound of a world going on with its work. Some debts get settled, some maps get burned, some nooses stay untied, and sometimes the life you end up with is nothing like the life you planned, And that turns out to be the luckiest thing that ever happened to you. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And it's yours. And you fought for every last piece of it. That's not a small thing. That's everything.